Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history, where we take one date on the calendar, shake it until coins and corpses and monarchs and propaganda all fall out, and then pretend humanity has ever once had a stable group project. March 9th is one of those dates that keeps proving history is less a straight line and more a shopping cart with one busted wheel. On this day, empires got challenged, priests got regulated, continents got mislabeled, wars got mechanized, markets got hypnotized, and modern life kept inventing new ways to look glamorous while quietly being horrifying. So let's stroll through the centuries and admire the species doing what it does best, which is making enormous decisions with total confidence and questionable paperwork. Segment 1. The queen who dared Rome and the nation born in a martyr's footnote. In 271, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra looked at the Roman Empire during the 3rd century crisis and saw what every opportunist sees in a collapsing superpower: management weakness. Rome was drowning in civil wars, inflation, invasions, and general imperial burnout. And Zenobia did not respond by keeping her head down and filing respectful complaints. She took Egypt, pushed into Anatolia, and then made the political equivalent of kicking in the Senate doors by minting coins that left Emperor Aurelian off the face of the currency. That was not subtle diplomacy. That was the ancient world version of changing the company password and announcing your toddler is now CEO. What makes Zenobia fascinating is that she was not remembered just as a rebel, but as one of history's great performers of sovereignty. She understood that power is not only troops and grain and trade routes, but symbols, titles, portraits, and the nerve to act as if your authority is already real. And then, because history loves irony the way tabloids love a relapse, her legend ends in contradiction. Maybe she was paraded in chains through Rome and retired to a villa. Maybe she starved herself rather than endure humiliation. Maybe every version says more about Roman anxieties than her actual ending. Either way, she became bigger in memory than her brief empire ever was in land. A few centuries later, in 1909, Lithuania entered recorded history not through a royal proclamation or some majestic founding anthem, but because a monk wrote down where a missionary got murdered. That is such a bleak and efficient birth certificate. The Annals of Quedlinburg mention St. Bruno of Querfort being killed in pagan lands, and in doing so, they preserved the first known written mention of Lithuania. Entire nations wait centuries for their official entrance onto the page, and Lithuania gets introduced like a crime scene address. That detail is a reminder that the written record is not a fair judge of importance. A people can exist for ages, in forests, in rituals, in oral culture, in trade, in bloodlines, and still be considered historically invisible until some scribe with cold fingers dips a quill and spells the name correctly enough to survive. Zenobia tried to force recognition by declaring herself Augusta. Lithuania stumbled into recognition because someone else died there. Different methods, same truth. History often begins not when a people become real, but when someone in power finally notices. Segment 2. Celibacy, treachery, and the medieval art of power. By 1074, Pope Gregory VII decided the church had tolerated enough earthly mess from priests with wives, children, family inheritances, and the deeply inconvenient habit of acting like local human beings instead of remote spiritual functionaries. So he excommunicated married priests, turning what had long been a tolerated reality into a crisis of legitimacy. The official line was moral reform. The practical effect was also brutally financial, because a celibate priesthood meant church offices and property would not keep leaking into private family dynasties. Medieval Rome was, among other things, learning the same lesson every institution learns. If you want central control, you start by breaking the informal systems people actually live in. Naturally, this went over terribly. Clergy revolted, councils objected, bishops got threatened, and the reform movement generated the kind of sanctified chaos that makes you realize religious institutions are still, at base, collections of stubborn mammals arguing over governance. Gregory's decree helped define the Roman Catholic clergy for centuries, but it did so by ripping families apart and drawing a harder line between priest and parish. It is one of those reforms history later treats as inevitable, even though it felt at the time like someone had set the building on fire and called it housekeeping. Humans love retroactive certainty because it saves them from admitting that most institutions were built during emotional breakdowns. That same collision between legitimacy and force shows up in the Battle of Klokotnitsa in 1230, when Theodore of Epirus broke his treaty with Bulgaria and marched in like one more medieval ruler, convinced that treachery is only immoral when it happens to him. Tsar Ivan Asen II answered with speed, military skill, and a piece of theater so good it deserves its own museum room. He had the broken peace treaty impaled on a spear and carried into battle in front of the army. That is not just propaganda. That is receipts. Ivan Asen's victory turned Bulgaria into the dominant Balkan power and shattered Epirus as a serious imperial rival. But the really striking thing is how modern the political logic feels. Betrayal had to be punished publicly. Victory had to be moralized. Clemency had to be selective and strategic. So releasing common soldiers made the conqueror look just and useful while crushing elite ambition. Medieval politics is often caricatured as random barbarity, but it was full of message discipline. The people of the 13th century absolutely understood optics. They just delivered them on horseback with more spears. Segment 3, how to steal a continent, marry destiny, and call it history. March 9th also gives us Amerigo Vespucci, born in 1454. Proof that if you get the branding right, history will hand you a continent you did not exactly discover. Vespucci's real gift was not planting flags first. It was grasping, or at least persuasively communicating, that these lands across the Atlantic were not Asia. That was the intellectual break that mattered. Columbus sailed into the story like a man refusing to update his software, while Vespucci helped Europe admit it was dealing with an entirely different hemisphere. Then, Martin Waldseemüller, working with the confidence of a man who had no idea school children would be stuck with his choice forever, feminized Amerigo into America and printed it onto the map. Imagine being Columbus and finding out the New World got named after a better publicist. It is one of history's funniest reputational muggings, and it reminds us that discovery is never just about getting somewhere. It is about who tells the story in a way institutions can absorb, repeat, and canonize. That same weird blend of accident and ambition is there in 1500, when Pedro Alvarez Cabral left Lisbon trying to reach India and wound up helping launch Portugal's empire in Brazil. Officially, it was a navigational detour for favorable winds. Unofficially, a lot of historians look at this and go, that seems awfully convenient. Nothing says stumbled into a continent like arriving precisely where a treaty line might reward you with one. Empires have always loved calling strategy an accident when the paperwork catches up later. And then, because March 9th enjoys mixing geopolitics with melodrama, we get Napoleon marrying Josephine in 1796. It was rushed, vain, romantic, insecure, and already half propaganda. They lied about their ages. He renamed her. He showed up late. And then he basically sprinted off to war 2 days later. That marriage was not just a love story. It was a prototype for modern political image making, where personal mythology becomes state architecture. Vespucci got a hemisphere. Cabral got a colony. Napoleon got a dynasty starter pack with emotional instability built in. Segment 4, mutiny, invasion, and the machinery of American power. In 1841, the Supreme Court ruling in the Amistad case gave the American abolitionist movement one of its clearest moral victories. The Mende captives had been kidnapped illegally. shipped across the Atlantic, sold, brutalized, and then chose mutiny over slavery. That is the part history sometimes sanitizes with courtroom grandeur. Before it became a legal case, it was an act of desperate self-liberation by people who understood perfectly well that official channels had no intention of saving them. Joseph Sinkay and the others did not wait for civilization to discover its conscience. They forced the question. What makes the ruling so remarkable is not merely that the captives were freed, but that the decision came from a court loaded with Southern justices and a political system soaked in slavery. John Quincy Adams gave the soaring legal defense, yes, but the deeper point is that even a compromised system can occasionally be cornered into recognizing a truth it was built to avoid. The Amistad story is about law catching up to morality at knife point. And even then, only partially, only temporarily, only because the facts were too glaring to bury. 6 years later, on March 9, 1847, the United States launched its first major amphibious assault at Veracruz. And you can practically watch the country rehearsing its future habits in real time. The landing was brilliantly organized, strategically bold, and devastatingly consequential. It opened the road to Mexico City and helped produce the territorial seizure that made the United States a continental power. Americans like to tell themselves expansion was destiny, as if the map just unfolded politely. In reality, destiny usually arrived in surf boats with artillery support. By 1862, at Hampton Roads, that expansionist century took another leap into mechanized brutality, when the Monitor and Virginia collided in the first great ironclad duel. The battle was technically inconclusive, but psychologically, it was devastating. In 5 hours, the wooden age of naval warfare basically received its termination notice. Sail, timber, and inherited prestige suddenly looked like antiques. Nothing makes history move faster than a machine proving the old romance is now just kindling. Segment 5, Black Flags, Border Fires, and the Invention of Modern Control. In 1883, Louise Michel raised the black flag during a Paris demonstration of the unemployed and hungry. And with one aesthetic decision, she helped give anarchism its enduring symbol. She rejected the red flag because it had become too soaked in defeat and blood, which is both poetic and brutally practical. Symbols matter because movements need a visual shorthand for grief, rage, and purpose. Michelle understood that before branding consultants started charging by the hour. The black flag said no compromise, no consolation, no pretending the old promises still worked. A few decades later, Pancho Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico in 1916 and shoved the U.S.-Mexico border into crisis. The American response was to send Pershing and thousands of troops into Mexico on a punitive expedition that burned money, strained diplomacy, showcased new military technology, and failed to catch the man it was supposed to catch. There is something almost timeless about a great power responding to humiliation by launching a large, expensive operation whose strategic outcomes are murky and whose symbolism is louder than its success. History does not repeat, but it definitely steals wardrobe pieces from its older self. Then in 1931, Ernst Ruska's electron microscope let humans see beyond the limits of visible light, which is such a perfect modern development. When reality would no longer fit inside ordinary perception, we built machines to shame our eyes. 2 years later, in 1933, Roosevelt's Emergency Banking Act tried to stop an economic panic by restoring confidence through speed, authority, and a kind of national psychological intervention. Congress passed the thing so fast, many members barely read it, which frankly feels like the most American sentence possible. One breakthrough let humanity see the invisible. The other convinced humanity to believe in institutions again, long enough to keep the vaults from emptying. These events belong together because modernity increasingly runs on systems people cannot directly verify. Credit, microscopes, borders, ideologies, currencies, state legitimacy. All of it asks ordinary people to trust forces too large or too abstract to hold in their hands. Sometimes that trust gets broken by hunger and black flags. Sometimes it gets patched with emergency legislation and a fireside voice. Either way, the modern world is basically an argument over who gets to define reality and which apparatus the rest of us are expected to believe. Segment 6, Firestorms, Plastic Dreams, and the Fragility of the Modern World. On March 9th, 1945, Tokyo was firebombed in Operation Meeting House, and the scale of destruction still feels difficult to process without your mind trying to step sideways. This was not just bombing. It was urban incineration, engineered with terrifying efficiency. An industrial firestorm that killed roughly 100,000 people and left 1 million homeless in a single night. The raid exposed one of the darkest truths of modern war. Once technology allows mass death at distance, strategy starts learning to speak in abstractions while civilians do the actual burning. Military planners discussed industrial output, human beings suffocated in canals. And because the 20th century refuses to stay in one tone for longer than 10 seconds, March 9th also gave us Barbie in 1959 and Sputnik 9 in 1961. One was a fashion doll descended from a German adult novelty figure who got rebranded into the smiling face of American girlhood. The other was a Soviet dress rehearsal for human spaceflight, featuring a mannequin named Ivan Ivanovich with dummy painted on the helmet so peasants would not think they had found an alien corpse. That pairing is almost too perfect. The Cold War was a duel between two superpowers selling dreams through plastic surfaces, one in toy aisles and one in orbit. By 1976, modern engineering was still reminding everyone that progress is not safety. The Cavalisi cable car disaster killed 43 people when a tramway cable snapped in the Alps, while the Scotia mine explosions in Kentucky revealed how industry can normalize danger until a community is suddenly counting fathers by who did not come home. One tragedy helped reshape lift safety. The other helped produce stronger mine protections. But the reforms arrived, as they so often do, after bodies made the argument more clearly than reports ever had. Humans adore prevention in theory and practice it mostly after catastrophe has already submitted the invoice. Then came March 9th, 2020, when Italy entered the first nationwide COVID lockdown. And the modern world discovered that all its speed, luxury, density, and confidence could be halted by biology. Streets emptied, economies froze, and millions confronted the eerie fact that civilization is held together by habits more fragile than concrete. Yet even there, on balconies above silent streets, people sang. It was not enough to stop the virus, obviously, but it was enough to remind us that when the systems crack, human beings still reach for ritual, performance, community, and noise. Which, if you think about it, is basically what history has been all along. In conclusion, March 9th is a date about threshold moments, the instant when old arrangements stop feeling inevitable and new realities force their way into view. Zenobia challenged empire. Lithuania entered the page. Gregory disciplined the church. Ivan Asen weaponized betrayal. Vespucci and Cabral helped redraw the world. The Amistad captives forced law to face justice. Ironclads ended one naval age. Radicals found new symbols. Scientists pierced new scales of reality. Roosevelt restored faith by velocity. Tokyo revealed the industrial logic of annihilation. And Italy showed how fragile normal life really is. The pattern is almost rude in its consistency. Humanity keeps building systems, symbols, borders, and myths, then acting shocked when they change shape under pressure. And that, unfortunately for all of us, is why history never runs out of material.